In Adorno's Negative Dialectics, on page 160, in the chapter on individuality, not the ultimate either, he says, confusion about identity tends to make thinking capitulate to the indissoluble. Such thinking turns the object's indissolubility into a taboo for the subject. The subject is to resign itself irrationalistically or scientifically and not to touch whatever is unlike it. It is to surrender, even to pay homage to the current cognitive ideal. This reminds me of the world into which we are flowing more and more. And the reason is because of the conformity that Adorno is talking about here. The subject within this context of the social is to resign itself irrationalistically or scientifically. Now, irrationalistically is the side of this that we can lean into more, that makes more sense, because irrationalism is precisely what the society demands conformity to of the individual. And the scientifically part, it's true that science can become a tyranny. But the positivism that was decried by the Frankfurt School has not panned out. Science has not turned into a tyrannical instrumentality. But what has turned into an instrumentality is irrationalism, in the sense that it demands authority for itself, it demands allegiance to itself, and it demands that it occupy the place of knowledge supremacy within culture. What this means is that a kind of folk epistemology approach to the world, an anti-scientific approach to the world, an anti-evidential approach to the world, an anti-rational approach to the world, is demanded by authoritarians to occupy the place of highest authority. It is a form of creedalism that is being demanded as individuals need to resign themselves to this, meaning they no longer resist it, they no longer question it, they no longer push back against it skeptically. The subject is to resign itself irrationalistically, scientifically, and not to touch whatever is unlike it. Precisely, we have here a narrative thinking. What is a narrative thinking? A narrative thinking and a narrative psychology, meaning that anything that contradicts one's creed, anything that contradicts the official narrative or a cultural narrative, is not to be resisted, but or anything that rejects it is to be resisted, is to be rejected. So any resistance, any critical objection, any criticality to an official narrative, to an official creed of society, is to automatically, by default, a priori, to be rejected as being false in this type of unadministered absolute society. And this is a real problem, because it means that rationality has fled from society. It means that individuals are navigating the world by creed, by worldview axioms, instead of challenging those axioms, thinking about those axioms, thinking about the premises or propositions of their creed critically. They don't even have the skills to do this. They are instead rejecting anything that challenges their particular creedalism. The subject is to resign itself irrationalistically and scientifically and not to touch whatever is unlike it. Now, I think Adorno has the scientifically part wrong here. This is where I just don't see the Frankfurt School holding up with these objections, because science has continued to make tremendous progress in a good way. And science has also pushed into domains of civility, into domains of empathy, into domains of compassion. And so the science has emerged when you take a collective body of, I want to call it progressive science, but I don't think that's the term for it, but let's just call it progressive science. When you take the collective body of collective science in sociology, in psychology, and in economics, in the form of the work that is done by people like Piketty, that is done by people like Joseph Stiglitz, that is done by people like Stephanie Kelton, and there's a lot of other names here, Nobel Prize winners, who have done tremendous work in the domain of economics, and what they have discovered is the formation of societies that are not instrumental, but they've discovered the formation of societies that are institutional. The formation of societies that have strong institutions are vital to the well-being of the individuals of those societies. And the scientific investigations have not pushing us in a direction of instrumentality. I see it as being the opposite of this. That it's the shunning, the folk epistemological shunning of science, a regression to willpower models, a regression to superstitious models, a regression to models that are based on appearance, that are based on forms of immediacy. These are the models that are actually set to bring about the kind of tyranny that the Frankfurt School and people like Adorno feared so much. It's not going to be coming through science, but it's ultimately coming through a folk epistemology that imposes itself and demands that it occupy the place of highest authority in society. The subject is to surrender, even to pay homage to the current cognitive ideal. This is exactly correct. We're looking at a society here where individuality is forced to surrender to a form of authoritarian irrationalism, to a form of authoritarian folk epistemology. This resistance is to surrender and even pay homage to the backwardness of the social situation. I will venture out to try to say something here that I don't know if I should venture out to. I don't want to say something that's a difficult area to speak in, and that is the area of the development of technology. Now, this is what Adorno is saying here is very significant, because very likely technology in society, as it's traditionally done, is going to be utilized by a ruling class to lord over the vast majority of the species, to enshrine a remnant in a position of privilege and power at the expense of the masses. And this model works very well today. It's still the model, the dominant model in the world, as is evidenced by billionaires, the existence of billionaires. Billionaires should not exist, but they do exist, and they exist because the technological structures of society, the law structures of society, have been loaded in such a way that they privilege and benefit a few individuals at the expense of the many. And so as we see technology begin to be implemented in the further control of society, we are very likely to see a real form of instrumentality in the sense that it is presented as pure rationality. So I guess in this sense we can validate Adorno's scientific claim of resignation, that it's irrationalistically and scientifically resigning. We can validate it in this sense. So this technology that's being brought forward, these automated algorithms that are being brought forward, are no doubt going to be implemented in the control of human beings' lives at a very intrusive scale and at a very high scale. And the thing is, I believe society begins to see the formation of a narrative of the not only the accuracy of these algorithms to lord over people, but the idea that these algorithms have absolute authority. That's really the problem here with this expansion of this technology apparatus and the way that it is viewed socially, the way that it is viewed as a mechanism of highest authority, and the instrumentality that is created by it, the platitudes, the structure that it creates, it suddenly becomes the normative structure of society. Now, as it becomes the normative structure of society, what Adorno is saying here applies all the more, is that the subject is to resign itself to this scientificness of this algorithm technology, and that it's to surrender and to pay homage to the current cognitive ideal. Well, here I think the cognitive ideal into the future will be the supremacy of these advanced algorithm systems, and we're demanded to validate that the instrumentality that they have produced constitutes the highest level of order and the highest level of intelligence for humans. That's, I think, the real tyranny. And these algorithms, this narrative has not been set in place quite like this yet. It's on its way to becoming this. And once it becomes this, the ability to resist it becomes exceedingly difficult. One, because it's everywhere, so that's a problem. Two, because the general masses are adhering to it and using it for everything in their own lives because they like the feeling of authority it gives them. It gives them the impression of intelligence, the impression of control. And that's not to say that these algorithms will in no way increase human intelligence. They may have this capacity, but there's still going to always be, I shouldn't say always, but there will be this problem where this narrative is not actually a competent narrative. It's not actually a civil narrative. Most importantly, it's not an intelligent narrative. It is a narrative instrumentality. It's a narrative that's pragmatic in the sense that it's brought about, it's given a place of authority to bring about a specific structure, a specific order. That's why it is implemented. That's why it's produced. It doesn't, the powers that be in this situation don't care if this order is in fact intelligent. They don't care if there's a more intelligent way to do things. They don't care if human thought can innovate better, organize better. They don't care. They will not care. It will simply be the implementation of this instrumentality imposed on society, and it will be justified because it brings about a specific kind of order. And the tyranny is that this order, what it calls an order, is not necessarily a form of intelligence. It's simply a form of control. As I think of this, this is a significant problem, and the individual, the subject, is to surrender, to use Adorno's words, even to pay homage to this current cognitive ideal of these algorithms achieving the highest level of social order. They will, in fact, advance us and carry us into the future. There could be progress within the domain of an algorithm order. And see, once again, because there's no metacognitive criticality, there's no dialectical capacity to go beyond the mere appearance of what's being stated, of what's being put forth, then there's a significant problem, because even though there are events of progress, there are appearances of progress, there are instances of progress, this is not to say that the progress that could be achieved is not this progress that's being displayed. What if this is so much lesser? What if the progress that's being made is really a sabotage still? It still constitutes a regression of society, because individual creativity and innovation, freedom, has not been maximized and unleashed, but it has been ultimately, this technology has been administered in such a way that this is repressed in humans. So this is one possible path. I'm not saying it's the absolute necessity of a future going forward, that this is what will happen. It's possible that algorithms, in unison with human intelligence, overcoming a regressive age that society is lapsing into in this era, does eventually succeed in bringing about a more civil and free society. That is a possibility that happens. But it's also possible that this is the worst tyranny that has ever been unleashed on humans. It essentially occupies the equivalency in society of the authoritarian concept of God. That is how it functions over humans, that it has an absolute mono-authority over humans, and that any act of resisting it, any act of pushing back against it, is looked down upon as a regressive act, when in fact it is possible for a dialectical logic, for a dialectical consciousness, for human thought within this context to actually overcome the instrumentality of the algorithm, and to think, to imagine, to construct a greater order than that which the algorithm has constructed with its non-dialectical, limited, instrumental, logical structure. Adorno says such a thinking posture is by no means alien to this ideal. Throughout, the ideal combines an appetite for incorporation with an aversion to what cannot be incorporated. Well, there we have more of the exact same. When we think of a society that's instrumental, that's ordered by perhaps an advanced algorithm, this ideal of thought within the human, Adorno's right at the foundation of this. The ideal that is produced, the delusion, a sense, the idealism that is produced in humans for this order, this combines an appetite for incorporation into a monoform of society that has allegiance to a dilapidated notion of socialization, or a dilapidated notion of order, instrumentality as intelligence. But it's really not intelligence. It's just a form of trying to organize everything in terms of the programming of the algorithm itself. The ideal combines an appetite for incorporation with an aversion to what cannot be incorporated. So let me state this in another way, with an aversion to the non-conformity. So the society essentially pushing back against the non-conformist act of thinking critically about the logic that orders this particular type of administered instrumental system. So the idealism, the ideology that is combined within humans at this point, they naturally are conditioned with an aversion to nonconformity, to the very thing that would need to be known. I think this is very interesting how Adorno sees this. He knows that in these type of societies, he understands the ontological nature of progress by making this statement. The very thing that would need to be known. So this psychology that is conditioned to put forward a conformism to this administered instrumental society, it is also combined with, it has an antipathy built into it, into its psychology, where it pushes back against the very thing that would need to be known, the crucial aspect, the necessary aspect, which is the aspect of resisting the logic of this order, the aspect of dialectically questioning or challenging the logic of this order so as to sublate it, to overcome it, so that the stupidity of the algorithm, the incompetence of the algorithm, the lie of the algorithm could be overcome, and that the human could then emancipate into a higher logical form that would in fact bring about truly a greater order, because it's an order that is not divorced from freedom. It's an order that is conscious of the necessity of freedom. The very thing that would need to be known. What is it that needs to be known in these type of a system? In these type of systems where it's administered, where everything is controlled through instrumental calculations, where workers are observed by a machine that is watching them all the time. What is it that needs to be known in this type of society? Well, I would say at the heart would be an attack, a shattering of the lie of the logic upon which the algorithm is based, because that is the thing that is deceiving the humans into thinking that they are practicing a higher form of logical order. And this statement here is very interesting by Adorno, because the very thing that would need to be known, I think this tells us that resistance in and of itself, in and of its ontology, is a quality of progress. That progress is of the nature of resistance. That this idea of things that have a necessity of needing to be known, where does the necessity come from? The necessity comes from the ideal, essentially, of freedom, the ideal of progress, the ideal of order as imagined, of course, because that is where it comes from in our intelligence. But we can think of better worlds, and this is totally legitimate. It's relevant. Everything in this sense, when you push it down to its base, there's an imaginary component to it. The human imagination is constructing it. But that doesn't mean that it lapses into pure subjectivity, because there are needs that human life has. And one of those needs is society, and a qualitative society that does not sabotage the development of the individual. So we don't end up in some nihilistic, relativistic subjectivity when we think this way. We just understand the ontological nature of progress. And here, the very thing that would need to be known, this idea of needing to be known, is that the need is based upon obtaining to a higher quality of existence, resistance as the foundation and the necessity of quality. And indeed, says Adorno, theoretical resignation before individuality works no less for the status quo, to which it lends the nimbus and the authority of intellectual impenetrability and rigor. Everything just falls into place and makes sense when we begin to think of a society that is administered through an algorithm. It makes perfect sense. All of this falls into place. So he talks about here the authority of intellectual impenetrability and rigor. And I believe what he is referring to here is the notion of intellectual work, the notion of intellectual forms of rigor that actually serve to fortify an administered society where the function of this intellectualism becomes very difficult for people to surmount because it takes on an appearance of authority, and it's very hard to overcome. It's like a form of scholasticism, even, we might say. And it doesn't necessarily achieve its authority, its validation in society through the substance of what it's claiming. It maintains it through the appearance of a rigor. And so it's very possible that a high-level instrumental society has this very rigorous, how are you ever going to refute the output of AI scholars? We'll put it in those terms, of scholars who make use of these algorithms. How are you going to refute them when they have utilized these algorithms in such a way that they have given off the appearance of the highest level of mastery and expertise? And yet, they can still be shattered by attacking the specificity of premises, or attacking the underlying axioms or assumptions that lie at the base of this particular form. But society is not geared toward that in this type of a culture. It's geared to submit to this rigorous, abstract form. Adorno says, the most enduring result of Hegelian logic is that the individual is not flatly for himself, in himself. He is his otherness and linked with others. This is a logic that comprehends the necessity of society. The most enduring result of Hegelian logic for Adorno is that the individual is not flatly for himself, in himself. He is his otherness and linked with others. This is important. There's an interconnectedness within dialectical logic. It understands interconnectedness. That's crucial, because if you remove this interconnectedness, you end up with the opposite of what Hegel put forward, the lie of the individual, which we have had in the world, which still dominates in the world, and that would be that the individual is flatly for himself. He's a monoform that comes into existence, and he's a self-sustained monoform that comes into existence and sustains himself, and so therefore it's a lie when individuals present themselves as, anytime they're in a successful position, they present themselves as having obtained unto that purely of their own willpower, as though there was not an entire material sociological process that went on that brought them to that position. And this is concrete. This is not ideological. It's not abstract. Even the greatest athlete in the world who trained by themselves and won a medal, they have not achieved that goal by themselves. They didn't grow all their own food. They didn't make all their own clothes. Let's say that they do swimming. They're a swimmer. Well, they didn't make the swimming pool that they swim in. Let's say they run in track. They didn't make the track that they run on. So they didn't make the shoes they wear. Most of them don't anyways. I think Prefontaine's coach made shoes for his students, but nonetheless, even he did not get the raw material to do that. The point is that there is a logic here, a social logic here that is inescapable, that's built into the material and biological nature of reality itself, and it counteracts any form of idealism that wants to claim that the individual is flatly, supremely for himself, is sovereignly complete within himself and for himself. So Adorno says the most enduring result of Hegelian logic is that the individual is not flatly for himself, in himself. He is his otherness and linked with others. What is, says Adorno, is more than it is. What does that mean? It's a very short sentence. What is more than it is. It's exactly what I was talking about a second ago. We look at an individual and we see the individual presented as a monoform. That's part of the lie of the culture in which we exist. But what is, this individual that's presented, what is more than it is. It's not the presentation that says this individual was able to run a mile at the fastest pace in the world, but that individual is more than that. That individual is not just what they are asserted to be, or what they appear to be. Adorno has a metaphysical premise of reality here that I think is accurate. What is more than it is. If this wasn't the case, then things would be monads. Things would be monoforms, but they're not. Wherever we see anything that's qualitated or structured in the world, it's made up of plurality, of diversity. There's no way past it. Everything from a book to a mountain to a human being. What is more than it is. And the idea that something, we see a great sequoia tree, the idea that this tree appeared out of history in this form is a lie. That tree is nourished by the rains. It's contained within a system that allows it to grow. There is an ecology to our metaphysics. There is an ecology to logic that is necessary, that if humans deny it and try to escape it, will result in destruction. Adorno says what is more than it is. This more is not imposed upon it, but remains eminent to it. This is beautiful because here Adorno is properly engaging in an orthodox understanding of dialectic, which is usually not the case with people who think about dialectic. They think about it as TAS, thesis, antithesis, synthesis. That's not what dialectic is. TAS thinks about dialectic as contradiction in dialectic emerging from without. And that's not the case in dialectical thought. Contradiction emerges from within, and that's what Adorno is talking about here. What is more than it is. This more is not imposed upon it, but remains eminent to it. It is actually contained within the very thing itself. The more is built into it. And it's built into it, of course, because of the system in which it is contained, because of the process in which it goes through, because of the way it develops. This more is not imposed upon it, but remains eminent to it. the individual is a diversity. That's my statement, not Adorno's. And Adorno says, as that which has been pushed out of it. So he sees this contradiction, just like Hegel saw it, emerging from within. What is more than it is. And this more of the other is in fact emerging from within the person themselves. I think developmental psychology is probably one of the best ways to think about this, that we are integrated into existence through our interaction with our parents as they model for us what being essentially means, how to conduct ourselves within our own biological form. They model that to us. It begins to live in us. And then, of course, it begins to be pushed out of us in a sense. I'm not sure what the German word there is for pushed. That's maybe a strange translation of this text. In that sense, says Adorno, the non-identical would be the thing's own identity against its identifications. I think what we have here is a clarification of how to attack the world of appearance. In that sense, the non-identical would be the thing's own identity against its identifications. So we are constantly pushing back. We are noting that our own identity is a contradiction of the identifications that we are being given in the world. Individualism, rugged individualism, monoform individualism, absolutist individualism is an example of this, because our own identity is actually a negation and a contradiction, a refutation of this lie of mono-identity. It refutes it. The innermost core of the object proves to be simultaneously extraneous to it. There we have, I think it's good to talk about developmental psychology, because the other from the outside, this begins with Adorno talking about the most enduring result of Hegel's logic is that the individual is not flatly for himself. In himself, he is his otherness and linked with others. So we're still within that context here. And so he says the innermost core of the object proves to be simultaneously extraneous to it, the phenomena of its seclusion, the reflex of an identifying, stabilizing procedure. I think developmental psychology helps us here once again, because the innermost core of that object is linked up with an otherness that makes that object what it is. And this helps us to understand the dialectical thought that Adorno is engaged in here, and the dialectical reality that we are as humans. We are not a absolute monoform of individuality. We are a being whose sense of self and contains otherness in it. Otherwise, there's no sense of self. This is where, says Adorno, insistent thinking leads us in regard to the individual, to his essence, rather than to the universal he is said to represent. So, this is where the term that sticks out to me here is the term insistent thinking. This is what Adorno has in common with Hegel. And it's one of the reasons that Adorno was Hegel's greatest student. There has never been a greater student of Hegel than Adorno. This is where insistent thinking leads us in regard to the individual. To where? Where does it lead us? To what he said about Hegel. The most enduring result of Hegelian logic is that the individual is not flatly for himself. In himself, he is his otherness and linked with others. There you have it. Insistent thinking system that persists, that continues to move beyond mere appearance. That's what he's talking about. Systems that goes beyond the lie of mere appearance. This leads us, in regard to the individual, to understand that his essence, rather than to his essence, it leads us, this insistent thinking leads us to his essence, rather his plural essence, that is, his diverse essence, his dialectical essence, we would say. This insistent thinking leads us to the human beings, the individual's dialectical essence, rather than to the universal he is said to represent as a monoform. The lie that the individual is said to represent a totality, a universal. He is the universal contained within himself. Wrong. That's completely false. When you think of the human being being the universal, it seems very obvious how distorted and false the reasoning is. The human being is not the universal. The human being contains components of the universal. He is also part of the universal. And so this is an ideological lie that humans have long foisted upon themselves. The idea that of the individual absolute monoform of the individual. The idea of the universal individual, when in reality, the individual is a dialectical essence that contains, he's linked up to an otherness with others, and that otherness brings about the development of the quality of his own individualism.